Does democracy have a future in China? Next on The Line. This week, China's communist regime told the people of Hong Kong they would not be allowed to vote for the island's chief executive in 2007. Beijing also announced that there will be no expansion in 2008 of democratic voting for Hong Kong's legislature. Last summer, 500,000 people took to the streets of Hong Kong to rally for democracy. Activists pledged new demonstrations to protest Beijing's decision. U.S. and British diplomats also expressed their disappointment. U.S. State Department spokesman Richard Boucher said the United States believes that the Hong Kong people's aspirations should be given priority in determining the pace and the scope of democratization in Hong Kong. Chinese Foreign Minister Li Zhaoxing denounced the comments as foreign interference and said Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong. What does China's handling of Hong Kong say about the prospects for democratic reform in China? I'll ask my guests. Harry Wu, a former political prisoner in China and founder of the Laogai Research Foundation. Kurt Campbell, director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Diamond Liu, formerly a professor at Hong Kong University and a human rights activist. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. Harry Wu, what does the announcement from Beijing about Hong Kong say about the prospects for democracy long-term in Hong Kong?
I met someone from Hong Kong said the Hong Kong people enjoy the freedom, but they don't have democracy at all. So I don't think the Chinese right now is ready for democracy. Even tomorrow, the democracy happening in China in some degree, but I don't think this country will right away come into democratic society. There's a long way to go.
Kurt Campbell, a long way to go in China?
Frankly, I think the most recent events in the Middle East should suggest to us that the United States has a great difficulty in predicting when peoples and regions are ready for democracy. I think it is, frankly, the height of hubris for the United States to be making any judgments about the preparation of readiness of societies. I personally believe that it's in the U.S. interest to try to balance larger strategic interests with a clear statement of principle that the United States does indeed want over time to see the emergence of a valid democracy in China. I think that suits our own interests and the interests of Chinese people over time.
Diamond Liu, what are your thoughts on the readiness, if you will, of Hong Kong and China for democracy?
People are always ready for democracy. Sometimes the leaders are not. For the last 150 years, every major Chinese leader had pronounced themselves for democracy, and yet none of them, when they come to power, had implemented the program for democracy. People are always ready. Democracy is for the people. It makes governing more difficult for the leaders, and most leaders don't like it. Now, the construction of democracy is a very different process from the practice of democracy. And what's happening in the Middle East is not that the people are not ready for democracy. It is how little people now know about the construction of democracy. I talk to people who are in Iraq very frequently, and they tell me that there are many things that are done wrong. And but what is going on in the Middle East does not bode well for China either, because if democracy fails in one place, it makes it much more difficult to build democracy elsewhere. And in China, people have been ready for a long time, but the leaders are not.
Harry Wu?
I want to make 2 points. First of all, China is a country, has a long, long history in the traditional feudalism and totalitarian regime. The people supposed never know about democracy. You see, the Chinese writing the democracy in 2 letters, Ming, Zhu. Ming is the people, and Zhu is the master. In the Western definition of democracy, the people is the master, democracy. Well, Chinese interpret they expand it different way, looking for a good master for the people. So that's why all the time we're talking about, what about Hu Jintao? What about Jiang Zemin? What about Wen Jiabao? Is there better now? The people never thinking about they have the right to choice. But today, it's happened in Taiwan. The Taiwan, 23 million people say, we have the right to vote, to choice. Hong Kong people have all freedom. Freedom of religious, freedom of press, whatever, but they never have a democracy country. Democratic assistance. So I think talking about China, about democracy, the first thing is talk about freedom first. If the people are not free, I don't think we can talk about democracy in China.
So does the freedom that people enjoy, Kurt Campbell, in Hong Kong, does that pave the way for democracy, or is it something that will sort of, is this a situation that can stay in place for a long time, or are there tensions that will break that apart, this question of freedom on the one hand and democracy on the other?
You know, there's this great question about what role does Taiwan and Hong Kong have in the future of China. Some suggest that the preservation of freedoms and the existence of a very robust, in fact, flourishing democracy in Taiwan sends a powerful message across the Taiwan Straits about, you know, how things could be done differently. Frankly, I actually don't think we know. I liked very much Professor Liu's point about whether the leadership is in fact prepared or thinking about democracy. One of the things that I was most struck by was 4 years ago the release of the Tiananmen Square papers, the sort of the proceedings of the Politburo in China immediately after the tragedy that befell the Chinese people. And what was interesting about this group of very powerful men is how insecure they felt. Frankly, how illegitimate they felt in the eyes of history. And I think that tells you quite a lot about how wary even the Chinese leadership are about their ability to manage a country in some respects they don't even know, because there's no way through voting, even public opinion polls, to get a real sense about how the country feels about the leadership class.
Well, Diamond Liu, is there an insecurity felt by the leaders of China when it comes to political reforms that perhaps they don't feel when it comes to economic reforms?
Oh, they're more than insecure. They're frightened in their boots. When Ceausescu was killed in Romania.
Ceausescu being the communist ruler of
Yes.
Romania.
Yes. There was so many reports about the leaders being frightened. And I don't doubt it, because they have done so many unspeakable things against the Chinese people. I wonder how they sleep at night. I like very much Mensch's quote about the difference between beast and human being. He said, when a man loses his conscience, he's no different than a beast. And among the Chinese leaders, there are very few human beings left. They sleep at night.
Well, Harry Wu, how does this issue that Kurt Campbell brings up of Hong Kong and Taiwan being examples for mainland China, does the information that's available in Hong Kong and what's going on in Hong Kong, is that readily available in newspapers in China itself?
The media in mainland China is controlled by the government, so it's a very small report about the thing happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan. But the people, personal exchange, there's like 500,000 Taiwanese right now living in mainland China, and Hong Kongese people frequently travel in China, and mainland Chinese people went to Hong Kong. They received the message. But it is not ready yet. You have to know 80% of the people in mainland China, they are peasants. They have no any idea about democracy, freedom, human rights. So, but anyway, the thing is, I want to say, the thing happened in Moscow in 1991. Sooner or later will happen in Beijing. We have to be ready for that. The communist system collapse is in the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean if today the communist regime collapses, tomorrow China becomes a democratic country? No, definitely not. It's still a long way to go.
Let's talk about the conditions when democracy is possible. There are three conditions that must happen all at once, but not at one at a time. First, you have to have a leadership. that would lead people to democracy. Second, you have to have conditional crisis. When there's no crisis, people are not willing to change. Third, there has to be international pressure. Now, in China, it's only one condition that exists now, which is a crisis. Under tyranny, China is always in crisis. At the moment, it's inflation and deflation happening at the same time, but there's no leadership and there's no international pressure. When neither of them exists, one condition is not enough.
Kurt Campbell, do you agree that those three conditions need to be all in place at the same time?
I think those are three of the necessary conditions. I would say that there are actually some others that we would like to look for. One of the most interesting things about China is that beneath the surface there is an inordinate growth in small organizations, what are called government organized non-government or government registered non-government organizations. Just an enormous increase in those groups that are associated with a whole number of things that can be, child health care, women's issues. And what's interesting, if you look at how many of these groups operate, is that they're beginning to demonstrate the patterns and habits of democracy. Not big-time organized democracy, but compromise, some voting, and indeed some, presentation of positions and decision-making associated with this. Now, the government watches these developments very carefully, and I think is a little anxious about them. But I see signs myself that I think that China could surprise us. As much as we talk about the Middle East today, I think in reality that the Middle East actually has a significant distance to go, where China, I think, already has some of the preconditions that would be essential for a successful democracy.
Well, Harry Wu, on this question of sort of civic organizations growing up that could lay the groundwork for democracy or be places where people can practice the virtues of democracy, if you will, how much room is there for that in China at this point?
Well, I would say, the first thing is tell the Chinese and Chinese government, let the people free first. Free for travel, free for express their idea, and free for do business, free for religions. And then we later talking about what the kind of social system and political system, the democratic or totalitarian system we want or what. Freedom is first. If this country is not free, what are you talking about democracy?
On that question of freedom, Kurt Campbell, the French-based organization Reporters Without Borders rates different countries according to their press freedoms and recently ranked China as 138th out of 139 countries, only with North Korea further behind. What does that say about the level of freedom that people enjoy in China at this point?
It's actually very distressing. And what we also see are reports that the various internet cafes and elsewhere where Chinese youth in particular are able to sort of monitor more fully global developments, that many of these are under very strict government control and quite a bit of spying goes on. That in fact is very worrisome, and in many respects you see, if anything, over the last several years that freedom of the press has actually probably declined in China overall. I think that the steps that will be necessary to help launch us down the road for a more freer expression of ideas as a first step is at least a opening press in which there is more debate around issues. Very infrequently will you have a debate on issues that are important. Just a couple of weeks ago, a physician who was at Tiananmen wrote a letter to the leadership about the horrors of Tiananmen and how the leadership had to, square with the Chinese people about the tragedy. Those sorts of public appeals are all too infrequent. And so I think if I would like to see anything, I would like to see a more open exploration of the issues that torment the Chinese people: lack of health care, tremendous problems associated with working conditions, no worker and labor rights, labor organization is extraordinarily difficult. Those sorts of things, I think, would be a valuable contribution towards a freer society. I appreciate the idea of sort of a totally free country. I think the worries associated with that would be quite substantial, and so I think that will have to be a more gradual process over time.
Well, Harry Wu, in terms of the Chinese government's comfort level, if you will, with freedom, Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, was in China on a trip through Asia just a week or so ago, and he gave a speech at a university, and when the speech was translated and they censored it. And among the things that were censored was a statement by the Vice President that, quote, "The desire for freedom is universal. It is not unique to one country or culture or region." Now, is the government that afraid of that kind of statement of the importance of freedom?
That's what I'm saying. The United Nations Human Rights Declaration only have one version. We don't have Chinese version, British version, American version, one version. That you are a human being, you deserve the rights over there, okay? Today in China, quite free in the economic area. In political area, in media, with the press. For example, last week, the Chinese have a new regulation. Everyone, if you want to get on the internet, you need a car. How to obtain the car? You have to register it using your ID. No car, you cannot get on the internet. And in Shanghai, all these computer, government free to put a software over there. And the software is controlled by the government. They can see what are you writing, which website you're going to looking for it. Is that free? If you're not free, what are you talking about democracy?
Kurt Campbell, on this issue of the internet, this very powerful technology that people have seen or had expected would break open freedom sort of wherever it would go, has China really succeeded in putting the internet in a box, if you will, and keeping that sort of force for freedom that the internet is from acting in China?
First of all, I think it would be fair to say that on many major sort of almost epical sociological issues in China, we don't honestly know developments that are occurring underneath the seams in Chinese society. I think there is ample evidence that a variety of international news seeps through, and that there are questions about certain aspects of how the Chinese regime is governed. I agree with all those things. There is also, frankly, very broad debate about America's role in the world. A lot of anxiety about what the United States has done in Iraq, worries about U.S. support for Taiwan, questions about whether the Chinese leadership have done the right thing in making a deal with the devil with the Bush administration about a whole host of things. And so, the interesting thing about these questions about clamping down on public opinion and the ability to know, it suggests that inevitably what Chinese people will think will be more in liking to American and other perspectives. I actually don't think that is the case. I think there are a lot of public attitudes in China that are in fact quite contrary to certain aspects of American foreign policy.
Harry Wu, does the U.S. have to be concerned about where China would go if it had more freedom and
well, I want to remind you that I quite remember that our former Secretary of State, Warner Christopher, he ended his diplomatic life. He gave a last speech in Shanghai Fudan University. He said, we have to deal with China. We are seeking a strategic partnership with this country because China is a superpower. Hey, wait a minute. How many Americans know that China is a superpower? Okay, the terminology superpower only for Soviet Union is gone, and China. Now we have another superpower. It's come from our Secretary of State. If this communist giant is still there, replace the Soviet giant, what can we do? We have to care about it. I'll give you another.
How should that express itself? Should it be in trying to accommodate China in maintaining stability while undertaking some reforms, or should there be some more aggressive effort at putting pressure on China to expand freedom for its people?
Well, today is nobody talking about talking about containment. Nobody talking about sanction. But we have to be aware our money is not only benefit the people. Capitalism doesn't mean democracy. Okay, there's many countries, capitalism country today in the world. They are not democratic country. Capitalist systems thriving in China, it doesn't mean China become democracy. And second, the money is benefit the government. Okay, and we really help them. In some of them, just ridiculous. Okay, I want to mention a case, Cisco. Cisco directly signed a contract with Chinese security system to set up a nationwide, from the top to the village bottom, to the top to the bottom, to the central government, to the village government, to civilian, all the people. And include fingerprints, image, voice identification. That means keep the country, keep the region stable. That is something happened over there.
I'm afraid we have about 15 seconds left. Kurt Campbell, what are your thoughts on how to promote freedom in China?
Let me just say, I think one of the most important things that's occurred during this recent period is that U.S. interests and attention are almost completely preoccupied towards the Middle East. We have very little attention towards Asia. And I think one of the things that I think all the speakers on the panel would agree with is that human rights, democracy, freedom tend to atrophy without appropriate attention from the United States. That's exactly what's happening in China today.
Well, I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last word. It's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank my guests, Harry Wu of the Laogai Research Foundation, Kurt Campbell of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and human rights activist Daimin Liu. Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can email them to ontheline@ibb.gov. For On the Line, I'm Eric Felton.